The Vanderbilts had money most people can't even imagine. Mansions that cost millions, yachts the size of cruise ships, parties that bankrupted smaller families. Everyone thought they were living the dream. They weren't. The reality behind all that wealth was darker than you'd think. Let's get into what actually happened to America's richest dynasty. Before we start though, quick favour. If you're one of those people who actually listens to these regularly, just tap the like button. Doesn't cost anything, helps more than you'd think. And honestly, I'm curious. Drop a comment with where you're listening from. Always trips me out thinking someone in Berlin is falling asleep to this while I'm recording it at like 2 a.m. here. Anyway, Vanderbilts. Get comfortable first. Adjust whatever you need to adjust. This one's a ride. Your eyes open slowly to unfamiliar surroundings. The year is 1650, and you find yourself aboard a cramped, creaking ship crossing the Atlantic. The smell of unwashed bodies and stale seawater fills your nostrils. The wooden planks beneath you are hard, nothing like your comfortable mattress back home. The constant rocking has made your stomach turn for weeks. Your body aches from sleeping on these rough boards. Your clothes are stiff with salt and your future is entirely uncertain. You're Jan Ertzen, though everyone will soon call you Jan from de Bilt or Vanderbilt. You've left everything behind in the Netherlands, gambling your entire existence on the promise of a new world. The old life was unbearable, with no opportunity and crushing poverty. At least here, on this miserable ship, there's hope. Land's been sighted, someone shouts from above deck. You scramble up to join the other passengers, legs wobbly after weeks at sea. There it is, a smudge on the horizon. New Amsterdam, later to be called New York. You have no idea that your name will one day be synonymous with this very city. Okay, so picture this. You're a servant, not a fancy, gentleman's gentleman kind of servant. Just a regular, do what you're told, empty the chamber pots kind of servant. That was Jan Ertzen's life when he arrived in America. Jan came from the village of de Bilt in the Netherlands, and when he started working for the wealthy Van Coven family, he needed a last name. So Vanderbilt it was, from de Bilt. Little did this poor immigrant know that someday his name would be on universities, mansions and museum wings. But here's the wild thing. It would take over 150 years before any Vanderbilt had serious money. Can you imagine? Your great-great-great-great-grandkids becoming billionaires? You'd be like, wow, took you guys long enough. This new world is nothing like they promised, you mutter to yourself as you scrub another pot in the Van Coven kitchen. Your hands are raw and cracked from lye soap and cold water. But at least I'm not starving. Your fellow servant, a woman who's been in America for 3 years already, just laughs. What, you ask? Everyone comes here thinking the streets are paved with gold, she says, scrubbing harder at a stubborn pot. Instead, we're all just trying not to die from the winters or the fevers or the raids. I need to emphasize this. The early Vanderbilts weren't special. They were just surviving like thousands of other Dutch immigrants. For generations they farmed, worked trades, scraped by. Nothing in Jan's life would have suggested empire. His kids were farmers and labourers. His grandkids, more farmers and labourers. Wait, it gets better. When the American Revolution happened in the 1770s, the Vanderbilts actually picked the wrong side. Several of them were loyalists who supported the British. Awkward. So much for family political instincts. Fast forward to 1794. That's when everything changed. That's when Cornelius Vanderbilt was born on Staten Island. Picture a scrawny kid with fierce eyes and a permanent scowl. That was Cornelius, destined to become the Commodore and one of the richest men in American history. But first, he was just an angry boy from a dirt-poor family on Staten Island. "School is a waste of my time," 11-year-old Cornelius declares to his father, his fist clenched at his sides. "I can already do sums better than the teacher." His father sighs, looking even more weathered than his 40 years. "Fine, then you'll work the boats with me." Cornelius wasn't exaggerating, by the way. The guy could multiply huge numbers in his head but could barely write his own name. He dropped out of school at 11, but that brain of his was something special. Not book smart, street smart, money smart. So young, Cornelius starts working on the ferry with his dad, shuttling people between Staten Island and Manhattan. The water is choppy, freezing in winter, and the work is exhausting. But the kid has this weird talent. He can look at any business and instantly see how to make it more profitable. By 16, he convinces his parents to loan him $100 to buy his own boat. That's like a teenager today convincing their parents to loan them $2,000 for a business venture. And remember, this family was poor. "You want to do what?" his mother asks, her hands on her hips. "Buy my own periauger," young Cornelius says, using the Dutch word for a flat-bottomed sailing vessel. "I can charge less than the other ferries and still make money." "And how exactly will you do that?" his father demands. Cornelius grins, a rare expression on his usually serious face. "I'll work harder than them." This wasn't just teenage bluster. The kid would row people across the harbour at all hours in any weather. Sleet, storms, freezing temperatures didn't matter. While other ferrymen were warming up in taverns, Cornelius was making another trip, and another, and another. There's this story, and I swear this is true, that during the War of 1812, the British blockaded New York Harbour. No boats could get through, except Cornelius. This teenage madman would sail through the darkness, navigating by stars, slipping past British warships to deliver supplies to American forts. The government paid him handsomely for each successful run. By 19, he'd saved enough to get married to his first cousin. Yeah, I know. Different times. Her name was Sophia Johnson, and she was apparently the only person who could handle Cornelius's intense personality. "I won't be poor," he tells Sophia on their wedding night. "I'll make us rich if it's the last thing I do." She probably had no idea just how rich he meant. By his early 20s, the Commodore, he wasn't called that yet, but we'll use it for clarity, was already making good money with his ferry service. Then he does something that might seem weird today. He sells his boats and goes to work for someone else, a guy named Thomas Gibbons. Here's the genius part. Gibbons was fighting a legal battle against a monopoly that controlled steamboat traffic. While working for Gibbons, Cornelius learned everything about steamboats and the shipping business. He was basically getting paid to go to business school. When Gibbons won his case at the Supreme Court, a hugely important case called Gibbons versus Ogden that established federal control over interstate commerce, Cornelius was perfectly positioned to take advantage. "The future isn't in sailboats or rowboats," he tells Sophia one night after the children have gone to bed. "It's in steam, and I'm going to build the biggest fleet in America." And damn if he didn't do exactly that. By the 1830s, Cornelius was running steamboat lines up and down the East Coast. He was so aggressive in business that competitors literally called him Commodore as a joke, referring to his fleet. The name stuck, though the joke didn't. Nobody was laughing at him for long. The Commodore had this business approach that was basically scorched earth. He'd enter a market, slash prices below cost until competitors went bankrupt, buy them out, then raise prices again. Today, this would be super illegal. Back then, it was just called being good at business. "I don't build for the present," the Commodore tells one of his sons during a rare moment of openness. "I build for the future." This wasn't just talk. By the 1840s, when he was in his 40s, the Commodore was already eyeing the next big thing, railroads. And this is where the real money started. But here's the crazy thing about the Commodore. He was absolutely ruthless in business and fairly terrible as a human being. He cheated on his wife constantly. He neglected his 13 children except when they were useful to his business. He once told a businessman who complained about his tactics, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" The guy was the original fuck your feelings businessman, except he'd have said it way more colourfully. His own son once said, "My father was a born fighter and money-maker, but of gentleness and affection he knew nothing." By the 1850s, the Commodore is moving his family to Manhattan. His oldest son William, everyone called him Billy, is his right-hand man in business. They buy a house in what's now the super-fancy Greenwich Village. But even with millions in the bank, the Commodore lives relatively modestly. He's not into showing off wealth, just accumulating it. This was a man obsessed with building something. What exactly? Even he probably couldn't have told you. He just wanted more. More ships, more railroads, more money. It was like he was trying to fill some hole inside himself that could never be filled. During the Civil War, he donated his largest and fastest ship, the Vanderbilt, to the Union Navy. It was worth millions in today's dollars. President Lincoln personally thanked him. Congress awarded him a gold medal. But the Commodore wasn't doing it out of patriotism. He was doing it for status. He'd achieved wealth beyond imagination. But the old New York families still saw him as new money, an uncouth ferry boy from Staten Island. "They'll never accept us," his wife Sophia tells him one night, "no matter how much money you make." "Then I'll make so much they can't ignore us," he replies. After the war, the Commodore goes all in on railroads. He buys the New York and Harlem Railroad, the Hudson River Railroad, and in his greatest coup, takes control of the New York Central Railroad. By 1870, he controls the most important rail lines in America. Let me put this in perspective. This would be like one person today controlling all the airlines, plus Amazon's delivery network, plus Uber. The man had a monopoly on how people and goods move through the economic heart of America. The money is now pouring in so fast it's obscene. The Commodore is making the equivalent of millions per week. This is Gilded Age capitalism in its purest form. No income tax, no real regulations, just pure unbridled wealth accumulation. In 1876, Sophia dies after 56 years of marriage. Despite his infidelities, the Commodore is genuinely devastated. Within months, though, he remarries a much younger woman, partly to spite his children, who he thinks are just waiting for him to die so they can inherit. By early 1877, the Commodore's own health is failing. He's 82 years old, confined to his bedroom in his Manhattan mansion. His body is betraying him after a lifetime of driving it mercilessly. You stand at the window of the Commodore's bedroom, watching as a light snow falls over Manhattan. Behind you, the old man wheezes in his massive bed surrounded by the finest linens money can buy. Yet none of it seems to comfort him. "William," the Commodore croaks, and you turn. His face is gaunt, his legendary vigour finally extinguished. "Bring the lawyer." As his eldest son, you've spent your life in his shadow, trying to earn his respect. Now, with death approaching, you're about to learn if you succeeded. The lawyer arrives with papers. The Commodore's fortune is now estimated at over $100 million. That's more than $3 billion in today's money. The family gathers as the Commodore makes his final decisions. First, he donates $1 million to build a university in Nashville, Tennessee. It will, of course, be called Vanderbilt University. This isn't pure charity, it's legacy building, a way to ensure the Vanderbilt name lives forever. Then comes the bombshell. The remainder of my estate, the lawyer reads, with minor exceptions I leave to my eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. The room erupts. The Commodore had another son and 9 daughters, and they've just been essentially disinherited. Some break down in tears, others shout in anger. You, William, remain stoic, though inside you're reeling. Later that night, as the snow continues to fall, you sit alone with your dying father. Why? You ask simply. The old man's eyes, still sharp despite his failing body, fix on yours. Because you're the only one who would have done the same in my position. It wasn't a compliment. It was an acknowledgement that the Commodore had recognized in William the same ruthless business instinct he himself possessed. In death, as in life, the Commodore had found a way to create maximum drama. The will was sensational news across America. The richest man in the country had just cut off most of his family from his immense fortune. The siblings were, understandably, furious. 3 of them decided to contest the will in court, claiming that Billy had unduly influenced their father. They're saying I hired a spiritualist, Billy tells his wife one evening, his voice tight with anger. That I had this woman convince father to change his will. Did you? His wife asks, not looking up from her embroidery. Billy doesn't answer directly. They want their share. They'll say anything. And here's where it gets really interesting. Billy didn't want this fight to go to court. Not because he might lose. The Commodore's wishes were pretty clear. No, he was worried about family secrets coming out in public testimony. So he settled. He paid off his siblings, though not very generously. The famous Vanderbilt fortune was now firmly in Billy's control. The newspapers of the time were obsessed with the story. "The Vanderbilt will," screamed the headlines. "Family at war." Americans were simultaneously disgusted and fascinated by this display of extreme wealth and family dysfunction. But the most dramatic chapter of the Vanderbilt saga was just beginning. The Commodore had built the fortune through ruthlessness and vision. Now his son had to figure out what to do with one of the largest personal fortunes in world history. And Billy Vanderbilt would soon discover something his father never had to face. When you're that rich, money itself becomes a burden. The Commodore died on January 4th, 1877. Billy was now the richest man in America, possibly the world, and he had his own ideas about what to do with all that wealth. It's the early morning after the Commodore's death. You're William Henry Vanderbilt, heir to an unimaginable fortune, and you can't sleep. You wander through the mansion, thinking about your father. $100 million, you whisper to yourself, the number still impossible to grasp. What am I supposed to do with all this? Unlike your father, you don't love money for its own sake. You see it as a mixed blessing. You're already in your 50s, your health isn't great, and now you have this massive responsibility. "Are you coming back to bed?" your wife Maria asks, finding you staring out the window at the city lights. "Do you think I'll be remembered as just his son?" you ask her. "Is that all I am?" Maria puts her hand on your shoulder. "You're more than that. You always have been." The truth is, Billy was actually a more naturally gifted businessman than his father. The Commodore built the fortune, but Billy would double it in just 8 years. Where the Commodore was all fire and fury, Billy was methodical and strategic. But he was also a man deeply conflicted about his wealth. He famously told a reporter, "The care of $200 million is enough to kill anyone. There is no pleasure in it." Billy Vanderbilt was a reluctant millionaire. Unlike his father, who hungered for wealth like a starving man, Billy saw money as a burden. He often looked at his poorer neighbours with something like envy. The constant anxiety of managing such a vast fortune was literally killing him. His health problems were getting worse, and he blamed it all on the money. "The public thinks I'm happy," Billy confides to his wife Maria one evening as they sit in their study. "If they only knew. This fortune is like an anchor around my neck." Maria puts down her book. "Then why continue building it?" Billy sighs and stares into the fire. "Because it's all I know how to do." And build it he did. Where the Commodore had been flashy and combative in business, Billy was quiet and methodical. He expanded the railroad empire, consolidated holdings, and streamlined operations. The New York Central Railroad became one of the most profitable companies in American history under his leadership. In just 8 years, Billy doubled the Commodore's fortune to over $200 million, that's around $6 billion today. All while complaining about how much he hated being rich. Talk about a weird flex. "Mr. Vanderbilt, what would you say to those who criticize your growing wealth?" a reporter asks him after a railroad board meeting. Billy, irritated by the question, snaps back. "The public be damned. I'm working for my stockholders." Oh man, that quote haunted him. It was the 1880s version of going viral for all the wrong reasons. What he meant was that he was focused on running a profitable business, not on public opinion. But it came across as the ultimate rich guy saying he didn't care about regular people. Despite his gruff exterior, Billy wasn't actually as heartless as his father. He gave generously to hospitals, churches, and schools. But he did it quietly, often anonymously. He didn't want the attention. In 1883, Billy commissioned a new family home on Fifth Avenue. It was luxurious but not particularly ostentatious by the standards of what was to come. Billy wasn't into showing off. He just wanted comfort. Let me paint you a picture of Billy's daily routine. He'd wake up early, have a simple breakfast, and then dive into railroad business until late afternoon. After work, he'd enjoy art. He was building quite a collection, have dinner with family and go to bed early. No wild parties, no extravagant spending sprees. Just a quiet, disciplined life surrounded by unimaginable wealth. "You know what my father would say if he could see me now?" Billy asks his oldest son Cornelius II one evening, as they review railroad ledgers together. "He'd say I'm not enjoying the money enough." Cornelius looks up. "And what would you say to him?" Billy smiles faintly. That he's right. I'm not. But I'm not sure he enjoyed it either. This right here is the central tragedy of the early Vanderbilts. The Commodore spent his life accumulating wealth, but never figured out how to enjoy it. Billy doubled that wealth, but found it more a burden than a blessing. But their children and grandchildren, oh, they would figure out how to spend it. Boy, would they ever. In 1885, just 8 years after inheriting his father's fortune, Billy's health took a turn for the worse. One day, after arguing with a railroad executive, he collapsed from a stroke. Within hours, he was dead. He was only 64 years old. Let that sink in. The richest man in America, and possibly the world, dead at 64 from stress and overwork. All that money couldn't buy him peace or health, or even a long life. The funeral was massive. Wall Street closed for the day. Thousands lined the streets to watch the procession. The Vanderbilt name was now synonymous with almost unimaginable wealth. Billy's will was more generous than his father's had been. He divided the bulk of his fortune between his two oldest sons, Cornelius Vanderbilt II and William Kissam Vanderbilt. Each received about $65 million, over $1 billion in today's money. His other children and his wife received smaller but still substantial inheritances. And here's where the Vanderbilt story really gets wild. Because these two sons had very different ideas about what to do with their newfound wealth. Cornelius II, or Cornel, as the family called him, was serious and responsible, much like his father. He took over running the railroad business and was known for his philanthropy. He gave away millions to charities, churches, and the YMCA. The joke in New York society was that any bum on the street could get $1 from Cornel Vanderbilt just by asking. Your generosity will deplete your inheritance, his financial advisor warns him one day. Would that be such a terrible thing? Cornel responds. My grandfather and father accumulated more than any family needs. William Kissam Vanderbilt, known as Willie K., had other ideas. He was more interested in yachts, racehorses, and enjoying life than in business or charity. And in 1875, he had married a woman who would change the course of the Vanderbilt dynasty, Alva Smith. Alva came from a once wealthy Southern family that had lost everything in the Civil War. She was smart, ambitious, and had expensive taste. She was also absolutely determined to break into New York high society, something that even the Vanderbilt millions had failed to accomplish so far. See, here's the thing about New York in the 1880s. Money alone wasn't enough to be accepted in high society. The old families, the Astors, the Schermerhorns, the Livingstons, looked down on the Vanderbilts as new money. They weren't invited to the right parties. They weren't included in the social register. They were rich, sure, but they weren't elite. And this drove Alva absolutely crazy. It's ridiculous, she fumes to Willie K. one evening. That woman Caroline Astor acts like her family invented society. Her husband isn't half as rich as you. Willie K., who honestly doesn't care that much about society, shrugs. What does it matter? We can't buy our way in. Alva's eyes narrow. Watch me. Alva's plan was as simple as it was expensive. She would build a house so magnificent that high society would have to take notice. Not just any house, a French chateau in the middle of Manhattan. $3 million, Willie K. sputters when the architect presents the estimate. For a house? Not a house, Alva corrects him. A statement. That's over $80 million in today's money, by the way. For a house. And it took 3 years to build. The result was 665th Avenue, a limestone palace designed by Richard Morris Hunt, with features never before seen in an American home. It had a gymnasium, a ballroom that could fit 200 people, and even its own power plant to generate electricity at a time when most of the city still used gas lighting. But the real masterstroke came with the housewarming party. Alva planned a costume ball so elaborate, so excessive, that it would be impossible for society to ignore. The date was set for March 26, 1883. And then came the delicious strategic move. Invitations went out to everyone who mattered in New York society, with one notable exception. There was no invitation for Caroline Astor's daughter. Now, at this time, Caroline Astor was basically the queen of New York society. She determined who was in and who was out. And Alva knew exactly what she was doing by excluding Carrie Astor from what promised to be the event of the season. The Astor girl was devastated. Her friends were all talking about their costumes for the ball, and she was going to miss it. She cried to her mother, who now faced a dilemma. Caroline Astor had never formally acknowledged the Vanderbilts by leaving her calling card at their home. the 19th century equivalent of accepting a friend request. But now, if her daughter was to attend this ball, she would have to. Victory for Alva. Caroline Astor came calling. The social barrier was broken. The Vanderbilts were in. The ball itself cost over $250,000, millions in today's money, for one night of entertainment. Alva dressed as a Venetian princess, while Willie Kay came as the Duc de Guise. Cornet Vanderbilt attended as Louis XVI, ironic given that king's fate at the guillotine. The New York Times devoted its entire front page to describing the event, down to the detail of each prominent guest's costume. It marked the Vanderbilts' official arrival in high society. But this victory came at a cost beyond just money, because by this point, Alva and Willie Kay had a daughter, Consuelo, born in 1877, and Alva had very specific ideas about how to raise a child of such enormous wealth and new social standing. Picture this. Little Consuelo, just 5 or 6 years old, sitting ramrod straight at the breakfast table. She's wearing a steel back brace to improve her posture. Her mother Alva watches her like a hawk, ready to correct the slightest slouch or inappropriate movement. "Back straight, Consuelo," Alva snaps. "A lady doesn't hunch." Consuelo, fighting tears, tries to sit even straighter, the metal rods digging into her tender skin. It's not an exaggeration to say that Alva was a nightmare mother. She was determined that her daughter would be the perfect society lady, and she used pretty much abusive methods to achieve that goal. "Mother, it hurts," Consuelo complains one day about the back brace. Alva's face hardens. "Beauty requires suffering. One day you'll thank me." Spoiler alert, Consuelo did not in fact ever thank her. Besides the back brace, Consuelo's education was intense and unrelenting. She had to become fluent in 4 languages. She had to master all the social graces. She was even struck with a riding crop when she didn't meet her mother's exacting standards. Not a fun childhood, to say the least. All this while, her father Willie Kay was mostly absent, focusing on his racehorses and yachts. He set a world record for sailing across the Atlantic in his yacht, the Alva. He built a private racetrack on Long Island because public tracks weren't good enough for his horses. The man spent money like it was his full-time job. "Do you ever worry we're spending too much?" he asks Alva one evening after reviewing the monthly household expenses. She looks at him like he's speaking a foreign language. "How could we? The money grows faster than we can spend it." She wasn't wrong. Despite their lavish lifestyle, the Vanderbilt fortune was so massive that it generated more income than even Alva could spend. For now, anyway. But Alva wanted more than just social acceptance and extreme luxury. She wanted a title, an actual aristocratic European title to add to the family name. "America has no aristocracy," she complains to a friend over tea in her palatial drawing room. "In Europe they understand proper social order." Her friend raises an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you plan to acquire a European title?" Alva smiles. "I have a daughter, don't I?" "Ah, yes." Poor Consuelo, who by this time is a teenager, is about to discover that her mother has been grooming her for one specific purpose: to marry into European nobility. This wasn't an unusual goal for super-wealthy American families in the late 19th century. In fact, there was a whole wave of these marriages, American heiresses with huge dowries marrying cash-poor European aristocrats who needed money to maintain their estates and lifestyles. They even had a name, dollar princesses. But Alva took this to a whole other level of determination. By the early 1890s, Consuelo is a striking young woman. Tall and slender, with dark hair and eyes, she's considered a great beauty. And she's also one of the most eligible heiresses in America. Her dowry is rumoured to be $20 million, an astronomical sum. And Alva has her sights set on the perfect match. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The Duke, everyone called him Sonny because his first title was Earl of Sunderland, was the cousin of a young Winston Churchill. He had an impressive title and an even more impressive ancestral home, Blenheim Palace, one of the largest and grandest houses in England. What he didn't have was money. The Marlborough family fortune was gone, and Blenheim was falling into disrepair. It was a perfect match, on paper. But there was one small problem. "I don't want to marry him, Mother," Consuelo says, tears streaming down her face. "I don't even know him." Alva's expression doesn't change. "You'll learn to know him after you're married." "But I'm in love with Winthrop Rutherford," Consuelo pleads, referring to a handsome American she's been secretly seeing. "Love?" Alva scoffs. "What does love have to do with marriage? You will be a duchess. That matters more than some fleeting emotion." But Consuelo continues to resist the idea. She doesn't want to leave America, doesn't want to marry a stranger, and definitely doesn't want to give up on the man she actually loves. So Alva, ever the strategist, takes drastic action. One morning she collapses dramatically in her bedroom. Doctors are summoned. Whispers spread through the house that Mrs. Vanderbilt is gravely ill, perhaps dying. Consuelo is called to her mother's bedside. "My heart," Alva whispers weakly. "The doctor says the strain is too much. Your refusal is killing me, Consuelo." Consuelo, horrified that she might be responsible for her mother's death, agrees to meet the Duke. Here's the kicker. Alva wasn't sick at all. It was all a manipulation to force her daughter to obey, and it worked. The Duke arrives in America and begins courting Consuelo. He's not particularly handsome, nor is he especially charming, but he has a title, and his family needs money desperately. In one of the rare moments of honesty between them, Sonny admits to Consuelo that he's not marrying for love either. "My family home is crumbling," he tells her during a chaperoned walk through Central Park. "The roof leaks in 30 places. The estate loses money every year." Consuelo, resigned to her fate, nods. "So we both have our duties." "Yes," he agrees. "Perhaps friendship can be enough." The wedding is set for November 6th, 1895. It will be the social event of the season, an American heiress becoming a duchess, joining one of England's most aristocratic families. But just days before the wedding, something unexpected happens. Alva announces that she wants a divorce from Willie K. Vanderbilt. This is shocking news. Divorce in the 1890s was scandalous, almost unheard of in high society. And the timing, right before her daughter's wedding, makes no sense. "William has been unfaithful," she tells the press, painting herself as the wronged wife. The reality was more complicated. Yes, Willie K. had been unfaithful throughout their marriage, but so had Alva. They'd been living separate lives for years. The real question was, why now? Some historians believe it was another power play. By positioning herself as the wronged woman, divorcing her philandering husband right before her daughter's society wedding, Alva ensured that she, not Willie K., would be the centre of attention. Others suggest there was an even more calculated reason. There were rumours that Willie K. opposed the marriage to the Duke, feeling that Consuelo was being sold off to satisfy her mother's social ambitions. By divorcing him, Alva removed any possibility that he could interfere. Whatever the reason, the divorce was a sensation in the press, and it cast a shadow over what should have been Consuelo's big day. The night before her wedding, Consuelo cries her eyes out. She's about to marry a man she doesn't love, move to a country she barely knows, and leave behind the man she does love. all to satisfy her mother's ambition and save a crumbling English palace. "It's not too late," her friend says, holding her hand. "You could still refuse." Consuelo shakes her head. "You don't know my mother." On the morning of the wedding, Alva finds her daughter still crying. "Shut up," she hisses. "There are reporters outside. I won't have them saying the bride had red eyes." So Consuelo dries her tears and puts on her wedding dress, a Worth gown that cost more than most Americans would earn in a decade. She walks down the aisle of St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue, past 2,000 guests to marry a man she doesn't love. Outside, a crowd of over 2,000 people has gathered, held back by police. The American public is fascinated by this real-life fairy tale, even if those who knew the truth understood it was more like a business transaction. As Consuelo and the Duke exchange vows, both of them understand exactly what this marriage is. She gets a title, he gets her money. The New York Times calls it the wedding of the century. Alva calls it her greatest triumph. Willie Kay, now divorced, watches from the crowd with mixed emotions. His daughter is marrying into one of England's grandest families, but at what cost? "Are you pleased with yourself?" he asks Alva at the reception, keeping his voice low. "Immensely," she replies without hesitation. "Our daughter is a duchess. What more could a mother want?" "Her happiness, perhaps," Willie Kay suggests. Alva waves this away. She'll be happy enough with her title and her palace. After the wedding, Consuelo and the Duke sail to England. She brings with her a dowry of $2.5 million in cash, about $75 million today, and securities that would provide an annual income of around $100,000, enough to begin the massive renovations needed at Blenheim Palace. For Alva, it's mission accomplished. She's now the mother of a duchess, connected by marriage to one of the oldest aristocratic families in England. She's climbed as high as an American social climber could possibly go. But for Consuelo, the fairy tale is about to become a gilded cage. And for the Vanderbilt fortune, this is just the beginning of its spectacular unravelling. Imagine stepping off a boat onto English soil for the first time. You're Consuelo Vanderbilt, just 18 years old, and you've left behind everything you've ever known. Your country, your friends, the man you actually loved, all to become the Duchess of Marlborough. The American newspapers call you the Dollar Duchess, and that pretty much sums up your value in this transaction. "Welcome to your new home, Duchess," the Duke says formally, as the carriage approaches Blenheim Palace. Your breath catches in your throat. The palace is massive. Over 187 rooms spread across 7 acres. It makes even the Vanderbilt mansions look modest by comparison. Built in the early 1700s for the first Duke of Marlborough, it's one of England's largest homes. "It's overwhelming," you manage to say. "Wait until you see the leaking ceilings," he replies dryly. The marriage was exactly what everyone expected, a business arrangement thinly disguised as a union of hearts. Consuelo got her title, and the Duke got her money. Within weeks, Consuelo's Vanderbilt fortune was being used to replace roofs, restore artwork, and modernize plumbing at Blenheim. But money couldn't buy happiness, especially in the chilly halls of the English aristocracy. Consuelo found herself isolated, scrutinized, and thoroughly homesick. The English aristocrats viewed her as a curious American specimen, wealthy but fundamentally inferior. "They think I'm some kind of savage," she confides to her lady's maid one evening as she prepares for another formal dinner. "Yesterday, Lady Pembroke seemed surprised I could use the correct fork." The maid smiles sympathetically. "They're not used. To Americans, Your Grace." "They're happy enough to use my money to fix their roofs," Consuelo replies bitterly. The Duke, for his part, was grateful for the financial rescue, but not particularly interested in his wife. They had little in common except their mutual understanding that this was a marriage of convenience. He spent most of his time with his aristocratic friends, hunting and attending to estate business. In an odd way, the marriage did exactly what it was supposed to do. Consuelo's money restored Blenheim to its former glory. She gave birth to 2 sons, securing the Marlborough lineage. The Duke got his crumbling palace fixed up, and Alva Vanderbilt, back in America, could brag about her Duchess daughter. Everyone got what they wanted, except, perhaps, Consuelo herself. "Do you ever think about home?" the Duke asks her one rare evening when they're alone together in the library. Consuelo looks up from her book. "Every day." "Yet you never complain," he observes. She gives him a sad smile. "I was raised not to." Meanwhile, back in America, the aftermath of Alva's divorce from Willie K. Vanderbilt was causing its own drama. In a move that shocked even jaded New York society, Alva married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont in 1896, a man who had once been one of her husband's best friends. Yeah. Apparently Alva and Belmont had been having an affair for years before the divorce. The scandal was delicious for the newspapers, who had a field day suggesting that perhaps Willie K. hadn't been the only unfaithful one in the marriage. Willie K., for his part, seemed relieved to be free of Alva. He remarried a woman named Anne Harriman, and mostly withdrew from New York society. He moved to France, where he could focus on his beloved horses without the constant social obligations that Alva had insisted upon. "America has become too vulgar," he tells Anne as they settle into their Paris apartment. "Too many people trying to outdo each other with displays of wealth." The irony of this statement coming from a Vanderbilt seems lost on him. While Willie K. enjoyed his horses in France and Consuelo played Duchess in England, another branch of the Vanderbilt family was about to embark on the most extravagant building project America had ever seen. George Washington. Vanderbilt II was the youngest son of William Henry Vanderbilt. Unlike his older brothers Cornelius II and Willie K., George wasn't particularly interested in the railroad business or social climbing. He was quiet, intellectual, and loved art and books. In 1888, during a trip to Asheville, North Carolina with his mother, George fell in love with the Blue Ridge Mountains. The views reminded him of European landscapes he'd seen during his travels. "I could build a summer home here," he tells his mother as they look out over the misty mountains. "Something simple and peaceful." His mother smiles. "You're a Vanderbilt, dear. You've never done anything simple in your life." She wasn't wrong. George's idea of a summer home quickly evolved into something far more ambitious. He began buying land, lots of it. By the time he was done, he had acquired about 125,000 acres of forest and farmland. For perspective, that's almost 200 square miles. Manhattan Island is only about 34 square miles. George Vanderbilt now owned a tract of land nearly 6 times the size of Manhattan. Then he hired the most famous architect in America, Richard Morris Hunt, to design his Little Mountain Retreat. Hunt had previously designed mansions for other Vanderbilts, but George wanted something different, something inspired by the grand chateau of France's Loire Valley. Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, was brought in to plan the grounds and gardens. This wasn't going to be just a house. It was going to be an entire self-contained world. Construction began in 1889. Hundreds of workers toiled for 6 years to create what would eventually be called Biltmore Estate. A private railroad spur was built just to bring in materials. An entire brick factory was established on site to produce the millions of bricks needed. "Is there an end in sight?" George's friend asks during a visit to the construction site in 1892. George gestures to the partially built structure. "We've only just begun. The main house will have 250 rooms." 250? His friend repeats, stunned. "What on earth will you do with so many rooms?" George smiles. "Fill them with beautiful things." The cost was astronomical, estimated at around $6 million at the time, which would be well over $150 million today. And that was just for construction. The furnishings, art and landscaping would cost millions more. While Biltmore was being built, George travelled throughout Europe, buying art, furniture, tapestries, and books for his new home. He purchased entire rooms from European castles and had them shipped across the Atlantic to be reassembled at Biltmore. On Christmas Eve 1895, George Vanderbilt officially opened Biltmore House to friends and family. The result was staggering, a 175,000 square foot French Renaissance chateau with 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. It was, and still is, the largest private home in America. Picture this. You're a guest arriving at Biltmore for the first time. Your carriage follows a winding 3-mile driveway through carefully designed landscapes until the house comes into view. And what a house. A massive stone chateau that looks like it was plucked from the French countryside and dropped into the North Carolina mountains. The entrance hall alone is big enough to fit an entire normal house inside it. A massive stone fireplace dominates one wall, large enough that you could stand inside it. The dining table seats 64 people. There's an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, and a library with over 10,000 volumes. "My God, George," one guest whispers at the opening. "Party. It's like Versailles." George smiles, pleased, but with better plumbing. For the next several years, George lived the life of a country gentleman at Biltmore. He employed over 30 full-time staff just to maintain the house, plus hundreds more to work the farm, dairy and woodlands on the estate. Biltmore was designed to be self-sufficient, with its own farms producing food, a dairy, even a winery. But there was one thing missing: a family to fill the enormous house. In 1898, at the age of 35, George finally found love. He married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, a well-born but not extremely wealthy young woman from New York. "What do you think?" he asks anxiously, after showing Edith around Biltmore for the first time. Edith takes his hand. "It's magnificent, but it's also a great responsibility." She wasn't wrong. Maintaining Biltmore cost a fortune, around $2 million per year in today's money, just to keep the lights on and the staff paid. And unlike his brothers, George hadn't significantly increased his inheritance. He'd spent much of his fortune on building and furnishing Biltmore. In 1900, George and Edith's only child was born, a daughter they named Cornelia. For a while, Biltmore was filled with the happy sounds of family life. They entertained friends, managed the estate's farms and forestry projects, and lived the life of American aristocracy. But the financial strain of maintaining such an enormous property was beginning to show. The annual upkeep costs were draining George's fortune faster than his investments could replenish it. "We may need to reduce staff," George tells Edith one evening in his library, ledgers spread out before him. "Is it that serious?" she asks. He sighs. Building Biltmore was expensive. Keeping it running may prove even more so in the long term. Still, they managed. George implemented scientific forestry methods on the estate's vast woodlands, creating one of America's first managed forests. The farm and dairy operations began to turn modest profits. They closed off parts of the house to reduce heating and maintenance costs. Then came 1914, and an ordinary medical procedure that would change everything. In March of that year, George travelled to Washington, D.C. for business. While there, he developed appendicitis. This was serious, but not usually fatal. Appendectomy surgery was routine, even in 1914. George underwent surgery and initially seemed to be recovering well. But then complications set in. An emergency second surgery was performed, but it was too late. George Washington Vanderbilt died on March 6, 1914, from surgical complications. He was just 51 years old. Edith was devastated. Not only had she lost her husband, but she was now solely responsible for the largest private home in America and the thousands of acres surrounding it. Imagine standing in the cavernous banquet hall at Biltmore, looking up at the 7-story ceiling, knowing that you're now responsible for every inch of this massive estate. The staff is looking to you for direction, the bills keep coming, and your husband, the man who dreamed all this into existence, is gone. "What will you do, Mrs. Vanderbilt?" the estate manager asks gently, a few weeks after the funeral. Edith straightens her shoulders. What George would have wanted. We carry on. And carry on she did. Edith took control of the estate's operations with remarkable skill. She had always been involved in running Biltmore, so she understood the businesses and the challenges. But now the financial pressure fell entirely on her shoulders. World War I brought additional difficulties. Many of the estate's staff left to join the military. Coal for heating the massive house became expensive and scarce. Luxury items were viewed as unpatriotic during wartime. By 1917, Edith made a difficult decision. To raise funds and reduce the financial burden, she sold approximately 87,000 acres of Biltmore's forest land to the US government. This land eventually became part of Pisgah National Forest. Edith kept the house and about 12,000 acres surrounding it. But even with this reduction in size, Biltmore remained enormously expensive to maintain. As the 1920s approached, the Vanderbilt fortune was beginning to show signs of strain across all branches of the family. The third generation was not increasing wealth, as the Commodore and his son had done. They were spending it at a remarkable rate. Meanwhile, back in England, Consuelo's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough had deteriorated beyond repair. They had been living separately for years, and in 1921 they finally divorced. Consuelo went on to marry a French aviator named Jacques Balzan, finally finding some measure of personal happiness. Looking back, she tells a friend years later, I realize my mother sold me like a piece of property to satisfy her social ambitions. Do you regret it? The friend asks. Consuelo considers this. I regret that I didn't have the courage to defy her, but I don't regret my children, and I don't even regret the experience. It made me who I am. In an ironic twist, Alva herself eventually became an advocate for women's rights and suffrage. The woman who had essentially forced her daughter into a loveless marriage for social advancement now declared that women should be free to make their own choices in life. Don't you find that somewhat hypocritical? A reporter once asked her at a suffrage rally. Alva fixed him with a steely gaze. I find that I was wrong before, and I am right now. Women must be free to determine their own destiny. Whether this was genuine evolution, or just another way for Alva to remain in the spotlight is hard to say. Either way, she devoted substantial time and money to the cause of women's rights in her later years. Back at Biltmore, Edith continued to seek ways to make the estate financially viable. Tourism was in its infancy in America, but she had a revolutionary idea. What if they opened the house to the public? This was a shocking notion at the time. Private homes, especially those of the ultra-wealthy, were just that, private. The idea of letting ordinary people tour your home was unheard of, but Edith was practical. The house was an architectural treasure, filled with priceless art and antiques. People would pay to see it, and that money could help maintain the estate. What would the other Vanderbilts say? Her daughter Cornelia asks when Edith proposes the idea. They're welcome to help pay for the upkeep instead, Edith replies dryly. In 1930, in the early days of the Great Depression, Biltmore House was officially open to the public. Visitors paid $2 each to tour portions of the house and gardens. It wasn't an immediate financial success, but it marked the beginning of Biltmore's transformation from private home to tourist attraction. The decision to open Biltmore to the public was emblematic of a larger shift happening within the Vanderbilt family. The age of building massive private palaces was ending. The age of trying to figure out what to do with them was beginning. And as the 1930s dawned, bringing the full weight of the Great Depression, more Vanderbilts would be forced to make difficult decisions about their inherited properties and lifestyles. The family that had once seemed to have unlimited wealth was about to discover that even the greatest fortunes have limits, especially when they're being spent much faster than they're being replenished. Across America, various branches of the Vanderbilt family were living in different degrees of luxury. Some, like Cornelius Vanderbilt III, son of Cornelius II, were still enormously wealthy. Others were beginning to feel the pinch of reduced circumstances. The problem with inherited wealth, Cornelius III remarks to a friend over brandy at his Fifth Avenue mansion, is that it tends to skip a generation in terms of the ability to manage it. My grandfather built it, my father maintained it, and I'm spending it. This pattern, builders, maintainers, and spenders, was playing out across all branches of the Vanderbilt family, and the spenders were about to face the harsh economic realities of the 1930s depression. While George Vanderbilt was building his mountain chateau in North Carolina, his older brother Cornelius II had been constructing his own summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. And I use cottage in the most sarcastic way possible, because there was nothing cottage-like about the breakers. Picture this: a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace perched on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. We're talking 138,000 square feet of opulence, marble imported from Africa and Italy, ceilings painted by European artists, a massive great hall with 50-foot ceilings. The breakers made even Newport's other mansions look modest by comparison. "What do you think?" Cornelius II asks his wife Alice as they stand in the newly completed Great Hall in 1895. Alice takes in the soaring space with its limestone columns and gilded details. "It's magnificent, but do you ever wonder if perhaps we've gone too far?" Cornelius laughs. "Too far? There's no such thing for a Vanderbilt." But Alice might have been onto something, because the breakers, like Biltmore, cost a fortune to build, around $12 million in today's money, and then required a small army of staff to maintain it. The family only used it for about 8 weeks each summer during Newport's social season. 12 gardeners just for the grounds," Alice murmurs to a friend during a garden party. And that's before you count the footmen, maids, cooks, and butlers. Her friend raises an eyebrow. "One does wonder where it ends." "It doesn't," Alice replies. "That's what worries me." Cornelius II died suddenly in 1899 of a cerebral hemorrhage, leaving the breakers to his wife Alice. He was only 55 years old, another Vanderbilt man who didn't live to see old age despite his immense wealth. Alice continued to use the breakers as a summer home, eventually passing it to her youngest daughter Gladys. By 1934, Gladys Vanderbilt, who had married a Hungarian count and become Countess Gladys Szczeciny, found herself in the same position as many Vanderbilts, land rich, cash poor. The Great Depression had hit the family hard, not because they lost everything, but because their lifestyle was so expensive to maintain. The annual cost of running these massive properties was draining their capital faster than their investments could replenish it. So Gladys made the same decision Edith had made at Biltmore. She leased the breakers to the Preservation Society of Newport County for a token payment of $1 per year. It was symbolic more than financial, $1 to maintain the fiction that this was still a private home, not a museum. "Are you sure about this?" her husband asks as they sign the paperwork. Gladys looks around at the marble halls that require constant polishing, the acres of gardens that need tending, the roof that costs more than most homes to repair. What choice do we have? We can't sell it. No one could afford to buy it. We can't maintain it ourselves. At least this way, it's preserved. The story of the breakers reflected a larger pattern happening across all branches of the Vanderbilt family. The massive homes they had built as symbols of their wealth were becoming financial millstones around their necks. Meanwhile, another branch of the family was experiencing its own drama, though of a different kind. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, son of Cornelius II and brother of Gladys, had a reputation that made the society pages regularly, and not in a good way. Reggie, as he was known, had two passions in life: gambling and women. He wasn't particularly interested in business or in preserving the family fortune. In fact, he seemed determined to spend his portion of it as quickly as possible. "Mr. Vanderbilt lost $70,000 at the gaming tables last night," a Newport casino employee whispers to a colleague. "That's well over $1 million in today's money, lost in a single evening." "Again?" his colleague responds with a low whistle. "That man could lose the family fortune if he keeps this up." "That appears to be his goal," the first man replies dryly. Reggie was what you'd call a professional sportsman, which was a genteel way of saying he didn't have a real job. He bred horses, raced cars, and gambled extensively. He was also known for his success with women, despite not being particularly handsome. "What do they see in him?" a jealous socialite asks her friend, as they watch Reggie charm yet another beautiful debutante at a Newport ball. Her friend laughs. "3 generations of Vanderbilt money, darling. That's what they see." In 1920, Reggie married for the second time. His first marriage had ended in divorce after 7 childless years. His new bride was a young society beauty named Gloria Morgan, who was only 17 when they wed. Reggie was 42. Gloria was beautiful, charming, and completely unprepared for marriage to an alcoholic gambling addict with health problems. But she was dazzled by the Vanderbilt name and the lifestyle it promised. "He's so worldly," she gushes to her twin sister Thelma before the wedding. "And a Vanderbilt, can you imagine?" Thelma, always the more practical twin, eyes her sister skeptically. "I heard he drinks too much and gambles away thousands in a night." Gloria waves this away. "Those are just rumors. Besides, the Vanderbilts have so much money, how could he possibly gamble it all away?" She was about to find out that even the greatest fortunes have limits when they're being depleted faster than they're growing. The marriage was rocky from the start. Reggie continued drinking heavily and gambling excessively. His health, already compromised by years of hard living, began to deteriorate. But in 1924, something happened that would have massive implications for the Vanderbilt legacy. Gloria gave birth to a daughter, who was also named Gloria. Little Gloria, as she became known, was born into enormous privilege. Even with Reggie's spending habits, she was still a Vanderbilt heiress. A trust fund had been established for her, which she would be able to access when she turned 21. Until then, the money was controlled by trustees. But little Gloria would never really know her father. Just 18 months after her birth, Reginald Vanderbilt died of cirrhosis of the liver, the result of years of alcoholism. He was 45 years old, another Vanderbilt man gone before his time. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Vanderbilt," the family lawyer says awkwardly, as they sit in the study after the funeral. "But there are some financial matters we need to discuss." Gloria, still in her black mourning dress, looks up with red-rimmed eyes. "What matters?" The lawyer clears his throat. "I'm afraid, Mr. Vanderbilt's personal finances were not in good order. There are substantial debts." "How substantial?" Gloria asks. "Very," the lawyer replies grimly. "The trust fund for little Gloria remains intact, but you personally have been left with very little." This was the harsh reality. Reggie had burned through most of his personal fortune. The grand Vanderbilt lifestyle Gloria had married into was largely an illusion held together by debt and the Vanderbilt name. Little Gloria's trust fund was worth millions, but Gloria herself had been left nearly destitute. "What am I supposed to do?" Gloria asks, panic rising in her voice. "There is a provision for you to receive $4,000 a month from little Gloria's trust fund for child support," the lawyer explains. "But that money is explicitly for the care of your daughter, not for your personal use." $4,000 a month in the 1920s was still a substantial sum, equivalent to about $60,000 a month today. But it wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle Gloria had become accustomed to, especially considering her expensive tastes and love of European travel. So began a strange chapter in Gloria's life. She used the child support money to travel around Europe, often leaving little Gloria with her grandmother or a nanny. She became a fixture of the cafe society in Paris and London, hanging out with royalty and celebrities. "Where's your daughter?" a friend asks Gloria as they sip champagne at a cafe in Paris. Gloria waves vaguely. "With my mother. She's perfectly fine." This arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Reginald's sister and little Gloria's aunt. Gertrude was wealthy in her own right. She had married into the Whitney family and was a respected sculptor and art patron. She was also deeply concerned about her niece's upbringing. "The child is being neglected," Gertrude tells her lawyer bluntly. "Her mother is gallivanting around Europe while little Gloria is raised by nannies and servants." "What would you like to do about it?" the lawyer asks. Gertrude's expression hardens. "I want custody." And so began what newspapers would call the trial of the century, a custody battle over little Gloria Vanderbilt that would expose the dysfunction of one of America's wealthiest families to public scrutiny. The trial began in 1934. Little Gloria was 10 years old. The Great Depression was in full swing, making Americans particularly unsympathetic to the problems of the ultra-wealthy. And the testimony was explosive. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's private life was put under a microscope. Former servants testified about her long absences from her daughter. There were allegations of inappropriate behaviour, including a shocking claim from a maid who testified she had seen Gloria in bed with another woman. The courtroom literally erupted, a reporter who covered the trial told me years later. The judge had to clear the room. In 1934, the suggestion of a lesbian affair involving a Vanderbilt was beyond scandalous. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from little Gloria herself, who told the court she was afraid of her mother. "She never played with me," the child testified. "She was always going out. Gloria's lawyers argued that Gertrude Whitney had coached the child, turning her against her mother, but the damage was done. The judge awarded custody of little Gloria to her Aunt Gertrude. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was permitted supervised visitation rights, but was effectively cut out of her daughter's life. Little Gloria went to live with Aunt Gertrude in her massive Long Island estate. The trial captivated America during the depths of the Depression. Here was this enormously wealthy child, fought over by wealthy relatives, while ordinary Americans struggled to put food on the table. It reinforced the perception that the Vanderbilts lived in a different world entirely. Poor little rich girl, the headlines called her. The phrase would follow Gloria Vanderbilt for the rest of her life. But the truth was more complex. Little Gloria had been born into material wealth but emotional poverty. Her father was dead. Her mother had effectively abandoned her, and now she was living with an aunt she barely knew. "Do you miss your mother?" a child psychologist asked little Gloria during a session after the trial. The girl stared at her hands. "Which one? My real mother or my nurse?" "Your real mother," the psychologist clarified. Little Gloria shrugged. "How can you miss someone you don't really know?" Aunt Gertrude might have won custody, but she wasn't exactly the maternal type either. She was busy with her art career and social obligations. Little Gloria's primary emotional attachment was to her nurse, whom she called Dodo. "Dodo's the only one who really loves me," little Gloria confides to her diary one night. "The only one who's always there." While this drama was playing out, other branches of the Vanderbilt family were experiencing their own challenges. Cornelius Vanderbilt III, known as Neely, had been effectively disinherited decades earlier when he married Grace Wilson against his parents' wishes. Neely's father, Cornelius II, had been furious about the marriage. Grace came from a good family, but there were rumours about her, whispers of affairs and social climbing. Cornelius II told his son that if he married Grace he would be cut off. "I love her," Neely told his father defiantly. "I don't care about the money." "We'll see how you feel about that when you're living on a clerk's salary," his father replied coldly. They eloped anyway, and Cornelius II made good on his threat. When he died in 1899, Neely received just $500,000 from an estate valued at nearly $70 million. His brother Alfred got the bulk of the inheritance. That $500,000 was still a lot of money, but not by Vanderbilt standards. Neely and Grace were forced to live relatively modestly compared to other family members. Neely even had to work for a living, taking a job at the New York Central Railroad that his family controlled. "How does it feel to be the first Vanderbilt to actually decrease the family fortune?" a bold reporter once asked him. Neely, rather than taking offence, laughed. "It feels surprisingly liberating." He meant it too. While other Vanderbilts were building ever larger mansions and spending fortunes on artwork and furnishings, Neely and Grace lived in a more restrained manner. They were still wealthy by normal standards, but within the Vanderbilt family, they were considered the poor relations. Meanwhile, Neely's brother Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt was living the high life with his portion of the inheritance. Alfred was handsome, athletic, and charming. He was also a skilled businessman who managed his inheritance well, at least initially. But Alfred's personal life was complicated. In 1901, he married Ellen French, a proper society woman. 7 years into their seemingly happy marriage, Ellen abruptly moved out of their home. The reason? Alfred had been having an affair with Agnes O'Brien Ruiz, the wife of the Cuban attaché in Washington. The scandal was enormous, especially when Agnes divorced her husband and expected Alfred to do the same. Instead, Agnes died by suicide in 1912, apparently despondent that Alfred wouldn't leave his wife. The tragedy finally prompted Alfred to divorce Ellen in 1913, though the scandal had irrevocably damaged his reputation in society. Alfred might have continued living as a wealthy social outcast if not for a fateful decision in May 1915. He booked passage on the RMS Lusitania for a business trip to England, despite warnings that German U-boats were targeting British passenger ships as part of World War I. "Are you sure this is wise?" his valet asks as they board the magnificent ocean liner in New York. "The Germans have explicitly threatened this ship." Alfred shrugs. "Lightning doesn't strike the same place twice. I made it across last month without incident. But this time would be different. On May 7th, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. The ship sank in just 18 minutes, killing over 1,100 people. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt was among those who died, but not before performing acts of heroism that would redeem his tarnished reputation. According to survivors, Alfred, who couldn't swim, gave his life vest to a young mother with a baby. "Women and children first," he reportedly said, helping others into lifeboats while declining to take a seat himself. His body was never recovered, but his legacy was secured. The playboy Vanderbilt had died a hero, sacrificing himself to save others. He was 37 years old, another Vanderbilt man who wouldn't see old age. Alfred left behind 2 sons from his marriages, including Alfred Jr., who was just 5 years old when his father died. The boy would inherit millions but grow up without a father. By the 1920s, the Vanderbilt fortune was spread across dozens of heirs. The railroad empire that the Commodore had built was still profitable, but facing increasing competition from automobiles and other forms of transportation. The 3rd generation of Vanderbilts was more interested in spending money than making it, and the 4th generation was coming of age with expectations of wealth, but fewer skills for maintaining it. "The trouble with inherited wealth," observed a banker who worked with several Vanderbilt heirs, "is that it rarely comes with instruction manuals. The 1st generation creates it, the 2nd preserves it, and the 3rd spends it." The Vanderbilts were now firmly in that 3rd generation, and the spending showed no signs of slowing down, even as the economic storm clouds of the Great Depression gathered on the horizon. Growing up as the poor little rich girl wasn't easy. After the custody trial, little Gloria found herself living in Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's sprawling estate on Long Island. At first glance, it seemed like she had everything a child could want: a beautiful home, servants, fine clothes, the best education money could buy. But what she didn't have was a normal family life or any real sense of belonging. "Aunt Gertrude means well," little Gloria tells her nanny Dodo one night as she's being tucked in. "But she's always busy with her art or her friends." Dodo smooths Gloria's hair back. "She loves you in her own way, dear." "That's the problem," Gloria says with a wisdom beyond her years. "Everyone loves me in their own way. No one just loves me." Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was indeed a complex guardian. She was genuinely concerned about little Gloria's welfare, which is why she fought for custody in the first place. But she wasn't exactly the nurturing type. As one of the first prominent female sculptors in America and the founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art, Gertrude was primarily focused on her career. Little Gloria saw her mother only during strictly supervised visits, which were awkward and tense. The custody battle had created a rift that neither knew how to bridge. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt remained in Europe for much of the time, living on the fringes of society, her reputation tarnished by the trial. Meanwhile, little Gloria was being educated by private tutors and attending elite schools. She showed an early interest in art, perhaps influenced by Aunt Gertrude, and was a dreamy, creative child. But she was also deeply lonely. "The other girls whisper about me," she confides to her diary at age 13. "They've all read about the trial in old newspapers. They call me the poor little rich girl behind my back." Despite the dysfunction of her childhood, little Gloria grew into a striking young woman. By 17, she was being featured in Harper's Bazaar as a debutante. With her delicate features, dark hair, and haunting eyes, she had an ethereal beauty that captivated photographers, and like many teenagers with absent parents and too much unsupervised time, Gloria started dating inappropriate men. In 1941, when she was just 17, she made her first major rebellion against her aunt's control. She married a 32-year-old Hollywood agent named Pat DiCicco. "You can't stop me," Gloria tells Aunt Gertrude defiantly. "I'll be 18 in a few months anyway." "He's all wrong for you," Gertrude replies, more sad than angry. "I've heard things about him, Gloria. Dangerous things." "You just don't want me to be happy," Gloria snaps back. She was wrong about that, but right about Gertrude not being able to stop her. The marriage went forward, and it was a disaster from the start. DiCicco was reportedly abusive, with connections to organized crime. Friends noticed bruises that Gloria tried to hide with makeup and long sleeves. "This isn't what I thought marriage would be," Gloria admits to a friend over lunch, sunglasses hiding a black eye. "You can leave him," the friend urges. "You're a Vanderbilt. You don't need his money." Gloria gives a bitter laugh. "I'm a Vanderbilt in name only until I turn 21. I don't have access to my trust fund yet." That would change soon enough. In 1945, shortly after her 21st birthday, Gloria Vanderbilt finally gained access to her trust fund, worth about $4.5 million at the time, roughly $65 million today. One of her first acts of financial independence was divorcing DiCicco. Her next move surprised everyone. She married the renowned conductor Leopold Stokowski, who was 42 years her senior. Gloria was 21. Stokowski was 63. "What does she see in him?" New York society whispered. "He's old enough to be her grandfather." "Stability," suggested some. "A father figure," said others. "Or maybe she just loves him," a few romantics proposed. Whatever her reasons, Gloria seemed happy with Stokowski. They had 2 sons together and lived a relatively quiet life focused on art and music. For a time, it appeared that Gloria had found the stable family life that had eluded her as a child. But if stability was what she sought, it remained elusive. After 10 years of marriage, Gloria and Stokowski divorced in 1955. A year later, she married director Sidney Lumet, marking her 3rd marriage by the age of 32. While Gloria's personal life played out in the society pages, the broader Vanderbilt family fortune continued its gradual decline. The Great Depression and World War II had changed America profoundly, and the old money families no longer held the same position of unquestioned privilege. Income taxes, which barely existed when the Commodore made his fortune, now took a significant bite out of investment returns. Estate taxes chipped away at the capital with each generational transfer, and the railroads, the source of the original Vanderbilt wealth, were facing increasing competition from airplanes and interstate highways. "We're living in a different world," Harold Vanderbilt, one of the Commodore's grandsons, observes to a cousin at a family gathering in the early 1950s. "The days of building 250-room houses are over." His cousin laughs without humor, and thank God for that. Who can afford to heat them anymore? The massive Vanderbilt mansions that had been built as symbols of the family's wealth were increasingly becoming financial burdens. Fifth Avenue in New York, once lined with Vanderbilt palaces, had been transformed. Most of the grand mansions had been demolished, replaced by commercial buildings or apartment blocks. "Did you see they're tearing down the old Vanderbilt Triple Palace?" one family member asks another in 1947. "Can't say I'm surprised. Who would want to live in a house that size these days? You can't even find staff to maintain them anymore." That was another change. The pool of domestic servants that the Vanderbilts had relied upon to maintain their lavish lifestyles had shrunk dramatically. World War II had opened up new employment opportunities for women and minorities who had previously formed the backbone of household staff. Many preferred factory or office work to domestic service, even if the pay was comparable. The days of having 30 servants for a summer home were over. America was changing, and the Vanderbilts were struggling to change with it. Some branches of the family adapted better than others. Those who had developed business skills or professional careers were doing well enough. Others, who had relied solely on inherited wealth, were finding that even the greatest fortunes have limits when they're being depleted faster than they're growing. While Gloria was navigating her complicated personal life, another notable Vanderbilt was making his way in the world. William Kissam Vanderbilt III, known as Willie K. Thruell, grandson of Willie K. Willie K. Threed had inherited his grandfather's love for boats and racing, but not his business acumen. He was passionate about speedboats and fast cars, setting several world speed records in the 1920s and 30s. But in 1944, Willie K. III died in a car accident in South Carolina. He was just 42, continuing the Vanderbilt pattern of men dying relatively young, often in accidents or from health problems exacerbated by hard living. "It's almost like a curse," one family member remarks after Willie's funeral. "The men in this family rarely see old age." Or maybe it's the pressure of the name, another suggests, always trying to live up to the Commodore's legacy. Whatever the reason, the pattern was undeniable. The Commodore had died at 82, but that was an exception. His son William Henry died at 64. Cornelius II died at 55. Alfred died at 37. Reginald at 45. George at 51. Willie K. III at 42. The Vanderbilt men seemed to burn out quickly, despite, or perhaps because of, their wealth and privilege. Back in Gloria Vanderbilt's world, her marriage to Sidney Lumet lasted only 7 years. They divorced in 1963 and, within months, Gloria married for the 4th time. Her new husband was writer Wyatt Emery Cooper, and this marriage would prove to be different from the others. "He's the first man who sees me for myself," Gloria tells a friend shortly after the wedding. "Not as a Vanderbilt, not as an heiress, not as a trophy, just as Gloria." Cooper was indeed different from her previous husbands. He was younger than Stokowski and Lumet, closer to Gloria's own age. He came from a modest southern family, not the world of wealth and privilege, and he genuinely seemed to care about Gloria's happiness and well-being. With Cooper, Gloria finally found the stable, loving relationship she'd been seeking. They had 2 sons together, Carter and Anderson. For the first time in her life, Gloria experienced what felt like a normal family. "I never knew what a family dinner was supposed to be like until now," she confides to Cooper, one night after they've put the boys to bed. In Aunt Gertrude's house, children ate separately with the nanny. With Leopold, everything was formal and stiff. Cooper squeezes her hand. "Well, get used to the chaos of family meals. We've got years of them ahead of us." But once again, stability proved fleeting for Gloria Vanderbilt. In 1978, Wyatt Cooper died suddenly during open-heart surgery. He was only 50 years old. Gloria was a widow at 54, left to raise their 2 young sons alone. "How do I tell the boys?" she asked the doctor at the hospital, her voice hollow with shock. "With honesty and love," he replies gently. "That's all any of us can do." While Gloria dealt with this personal tragedy, the broader Vanderbilt family was experiencing a collective realization. In 1973, the family organized a reunion at Vanderbilt University, the institution founded with the Commodore's initial $1 million donation nearly a century earlier. As family members from various branches gathered, they made a startling discovery. Not one of them was a millionaire. The fortune had been so divided and diluted across generations, so diminished by taxes and spending, that none of the individual Vanderbilts could claim the wealth that had once defined the family name. "How is that possible?" a younger family member asks in disbelief. "We were the richest family in America." "We're being the operative word," an older cousin replies dryly. "Money doesn't last forever, especially when it's divided among dozens of heirs with expensive tastes." This wasn't to say they were poor. Most were still comfortably upper middle class. But the vast wealth that had allowed previous generations to build palaces and live like royalty was gone. The Vanderbilts had joined the ranks of ordinary wealthy Americans rather than occupying the rarefied tier of the ultra-rich. Some blamed the Commodore for not establishing better financial structures to preserve the wealth. Unlike fellow robber baron John Jacob Astor, who had set up trust that required each generation to preserve capital for the next, the Commodore had given his heirs more direct control over their inheritance, control they had used to spend rather than grow the fortune. The Astor family required each generation to keep half the money in trust for the next, an elderly Vanderbilt explains to younger family members at the reunion. "We had no such requirements. Each generation could spend as they pleased, and Lord knows we did." Others pointed to the changing economic landscape of America. The Commodore had built his fortune in an era without income taxes, without estate taxes, with minimal regulation. Each subsequent generation faced a more challenging environment for preserving wealth. "The America that made us rich no longer exists," one Vanderbilt observes. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing for the country, even if it's been hard on families like ours." By the late 1970s, Gloria Vanderbilt was focusing less on her inheritance and more on building something of her own. Despite being in her 50s, an age when many people start thinking about retirement, Gloria was reinventing herself as a designer and entrepreneur. She'd always had an eye for art and fashion. Now she was putting that aesthetic sense to commercial use, licensing her name for a line of designer jeans. It was a revolutionary concept at the time. Jeans were considered casual workwear, not a designer item. "Designer jeans?" her business manager asks skeptically when she first proposes the idea. "Who's going to pay premium prices for denim?" Gloria smiles confidently. "Just wait and see." She was right to be confident. The Gloria Vanderbilt jeans, with their signature swan logo and perfect fit, became a massive hit. Suddenly, women were willing to pay $40 for a pair of jeans, about $150 in today's money, when standard jeans cost a quarter of that. In a delicious irony, Gloria Vanderbilt, who'd inherited millions only to see much of it frittered away by financial mismanagement and failed marriages, was now making millions on her own through business acumen and hard work. "How does it feel to be earning your own fortune?" a reporter asks her at the height of her jeans empire. Gloria's smile is genuine. "Liberating. The money I inherited came with so many strings attached, so many expectations and obligations. This money is truly mine, earned through my own efforts." It was a remarkable third act for a woman whose life had begun with so much privilege, yet so little emotional security. The poor little rich girl had transformed herself into a successful businesswoman, proving that there was more to her than just the famous Vanderbilt name. But even as Gloria found professional success, Personal tragedy continued to shadow her life. In 1988, her son Carter, just 23 years old, died by suicide, jumping from the 14th floor terrace of her Manhattan apartment while she watched in horror, unable to stop him. No parent should outlive their child, she says simply to a friend in the aftermath, her grief too profound for elaborate expression. Carter's death devastated Gloria, but she survived it, as she had survived so many other losses and challenges in her long life. Her resilience was perhaps her most remarkable quality, more impressive than her beauty or her business success or even her famous name. Gloria's other son, Anderson Cooper, would go on to build his own successful career as a journalist and television personality, deliberately without using the Vanderbilt name professionally. Like his mother, he seemed determined to succeed on his own merits, rather than trading on the family legacy. "Did you ever consider using Vanderbilt as part of your professional name?" a colleague once asked him. Anderson shook his head. "I wanted to see if I could make it on my own. The Vanderbilt name comes with a lot of baggage and preconceptions." In this, Anderson reflected a larger truth about the Vanderbilt legacy. The name that had once opened every door in America, that had represented almost unimaginable wealth and privilege, had become in some ways a burden to those who inherited it, a constant reminder of former glory, of riches squandered, of a family that had risen spectacularly, only to gradually fade back into the ranks of ordinary wealth. The Vanderbilts had experienced the most American of stories, a meteoric rise followed by a long, slow decline. From the Commodore's humble beginnings on Staten Island to the glittering peak of the Gilded Age to the dispersal of the fortune across generations, they had lived out a cautionary tale about the impermanence of wealth and the dangers of valuing money above all else. People are always fascinated by the fall of great fortunes, Gloria reflects in an interview late in her life. But what they don't understand is that money itself never made any of us happy. It was always the search for love that drove us, and in that, the Vanderbilts were no different from anyone else. How does a family lose a fortune that massive? I mean, the Vanderbilts were literally the richest family in America. So what happened? How did they go from stupidly rich to just regular rich in just a few generations? The answer lies in a perfect storm of factors, some specific to the Vanderbilts, others common to many wealthy families of the Gilded Age. Let's start with the most visible symbol of their wealth and their biggest financial drain, those ridiculous houses. We've already talked about Biltmore and the Breakers, but those were just the tip of the iceberg. At their peak, the Vanderbilts owned dozens of mansions, each one more opulent than the last. Picture this. You're standing on Fifth Avenue in New York in the 1890s. Looking down the street, you see mansion after mansion, all owned by different branches of the Vanderbilt family. There was the Petit Chateau, built by William K. Vanderbilt and Alva. Next door was the Triple Palace, 3 connected mansions for 3 different Vanderbilt families. Further down was the massive French Renaissance chateau built by Cornelius II. It looks like they're trying to recreate the royal quarter of a European capital, a visitor from London remarks to his New York host as they stroll down the avenue. "That's exactly what they're doing," the New Yorker replies, "except these palaces are only occupied a few months of the year." And therein lay one of the problems. These weren't just homes, they were statements, built to impress rather than to live in. The Vanderbilts maintained elaborate schedules, moving between properties with the seasons like migratory birds made of money. Winter might be spent at their Fifth Avenue mansion in New York. Spring could find them at their country estate in Hyde Park or Newport. Summer was definitely Newport season, where the breakers and other cottages hosted elaborate parties. Fall might mean a stay at Biltmore in North Carolina, and that doesn't even count their European properties. The heating bill for the breakers alone would bankrupt a normal family, a Newport local quips to a neighbour as they watch servants opening the mansion for the season. And they're only here 8 weeks of the year. Each of these properties required a full staff year-round, even when the family wasn't in residence. Gardeners had to maintain the grounds. Security was needed to protect the art and valuables. Engineers kept the mechanical systems running. Cleaning staff preserved the interiors. It was like maintaining museums, dozens of them. By the 1940s, the cost of keeping these mansions had become unsustainable. Property taxes were rising. Skilled domestic help was harder to find and more expensive to employ. The maintenance costs for century-old buildings were astronomical. "What are we supposed to do with these places?" one Vanderbilt heir asks during a family meeting about their Fifth Avenue mansion. "No one wants to live in a 50-room house anymore. We can't sell it. Who would buy it? We can't afford to maintain it. We're trapped." The solution, in many cases, was demolition. One by one, the great Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue were torn down, replaced by commercial buildings or apartment blocks. By the 1950s, almost all were gone. The land was valuable, but the houses themselves had become white elephants, expensive to keep, impossible to sell. But the houses were just symptoms of a larger issue. The Vanderbilt spent money like no one else. They collected art like it was going out of style. They built private railways just to reach their homes. They maintained fleets of yachts. They threw parties that cost millions in today's money for a single evening's entertainment. When my grandfather wanted to travel to his country home, a fourth-generation Vanderbilt tells a friend in the 1960s, he didn't just take a car or even a limousine. He had a private train with a full dining car and sleeping compartments. "For a 2-hour journey," his friend laughs. "That seems excessive." "That was the point," the Vanderbilt replies. "Excess was the family business." Another factor in the decline was the lack of financial structures to preserve the wealth across generations. Here, the comparison with the Astor family is instructive. John Jacob Astor, another 19th century multimillionaire, established strict provisions for his fortune. His will required that half of each inheritance be kept in trust for the next generation. Vanderbilt heirs, by contrast, generally received their full inheritance outright, with no obligation to preserve capital for their children. The Astors understood something fundamental about wealth, a financial advisor to both families explained years later. If each generation spends just a bit more than the investment returns, eventually there's nothing left. Their 50-50 rule meant that even spendthrift heirs could only damage half their inheritance. The Commodore, for all his business genius, failed to implement similar protections. He believed in survival of the fittest. If his descendants couldn't manage their money, perhaps they didn't deserve to keep it. It was a philosophy that aligned with his ruthless approach to business, but proved disastrous for the family fortune. Then there was the matter of too many heirs. By the third and fourth generations, the Vanderbilt fortune had been divided among dozens of descendants. What had been an unimaginable sum when concentrated in the hands of the Commodore, or even his son William, became much more modest when split 50 ways. Simple math, as one family member put it. Take $1 billion, divide it by enough people, eventually everyone has just a few million. Split those few million among their children, and soon you're talking about regular upper-middle-class money, not dynasty wealth. Another crucial factor was the changing tax landscape of America. When the Commodore made his fortune in the mid-19th century, there was no federal income tax, no estate tax, no capital gains tax. The government took virtually none of his earnings or wealth. By the time his great-grandchildren were inheriting, the picture had changed dramatically. The federal income tax, introduced in 1913, eventually reached rates as high as 94% for the highest brackets during the 1940s. Estate taxes claimed substantial portions of each inheritance. What had once been a tax-free fortune was now being steadily eroded with each generational transfer. My grandfather used to say that a third of the fortune went to the family, a third went to maintenance and staff, and a third went to the government, a Vanderbilt descendant recalled. By the time it filtered down to my generation, the government's share was much larger and the family's much smaller. The timing of American tax policy changes couldn't have been worse for the Vanderbilts. The heaviest taxation came just as the family was transitioning from wealth creators to wealth inheritors. Had these taxes existed in the Commodore's day, he might have structured things differently. By the time they arrived, it was too late. But perhaps the most fundamental reason for the decline was the shift in values from one generation to the next. The Commodore was ruthless, driven, and focused entirely on business. His son, William Henry, had somewhat softer edges, but was still a gifted businessman who doubled the family fortune. After that, though, the pattern changed. Few of the subsequent Vanderbilts showed much interest in or aptitude for business. They were collectors, sportsmen, socialites, and dilettantes, talented at spending money, but not at making it. The first generation makes it, the second generation maintains it, the third generation spends it, goes an old adage about family wealth. The Vanderbilts followed this pattern almost perfectly. My father always said we were taught how to be rich but never how to make money, a fourth-generation Vanderbilt observed in the 1970s. We learned which fork to use at dinner, but not how to read a balance sheet. We could order in French but couldn't understand a business contract. This lack of financial education proved fatal to the fortune. Each generation lived off the capital rather than just the income, gradually depleting what had once seemed an inexhaustible supply of money. By the 1970s, even the trust funds were running dry. Gloria Vanderbilt, who had once been America's most famous heiress, found herself creating a new fortune through her fashion empire because her inherited wealth was largely gone, lost through a combination of mismanagement, bad advice, and lavish spending. The day I realized I needed to make my own money was terrifying, and then liberating, Gloria told a reporter late in life. Suddenly I wasn't defined by a fortune I'd done nothing to earn. I could create something of my own. Not all the Vanderbilts experienced financial difficulties, of course. Those who developed their own careers or businesses often did well. But the days of building 250-room houses and maintaining a staff of hundreds were over. The Vanderbilts had rejoined the ranks of the merely wealthy, rather than occupying the stratosphere of the ultra-rich. One of the most visible symbols of this decline was the fate of those magnificent homes they'd built. By the 1950s, most of the Fifth Avenue mansions were gone. Newport's massive cottages had largely been turned over to preservation societies or opened as tourist attractions. The Breakers, once the private playground of the Cornelius Vanderbilt branch, now welcomes thousands of paying visitors each year. My great-grandfather built this as a private home, a Vanderbilt descendant muses, while visiting the Breakers as a tourist in the 1980s. Now I pay admission to see it like everyone else. There's something humbling about that. Biltmore had a slightly different fate. Still owned by George Vanderbilt's descendants, it has been transformed into a highly successful tourist attraction and diversified business, with a hotel, winery, and working farm on the property. The family kept ownership by turning the White Elephant into a profitable enterprise, perhaps the most entrepreneurial move any Vanderbilt had made since the Commodore's day. "We couldn't afford to keep it as a private home," William Cecil, George Vanderbilt's grandson, explained about Biltmore, "so we had to make it pay for itself." This pragmatic approach, so different from the aristocratic pretensions of earlier Vanderbilt generations, helped preserve at least one of the great family homes for posterity. Not all the mansions were so lucky. Many were demolished when maintenance became too expensive. Others burned down. Some were donated to universities or governments. A few were purchased by nouveau riche families of later eras, continuing the cycle of wealth and display. "It's strange to think that most of what the Vanderbilts built is gone," an architectural historian noted in the 1990s. "For a family that tried so hard to create permanent monuments to their wealth, very little remains intact." Indeed, the physical legacy of the Vanderbilts is surprisingly modest given the magnitude of their former wealth. Biltmore still stands. The breakers and a few other Newport cottages survive as museums. Vanderbilt University continues to educate students. The Whitney Museum, founded by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, remains an important cultural institution. But the vast majority of what they created, the mansions, the artwork collections, the elaborate gardens, the private railways, has disappeared, either physically demolished or dispersed through sales and auctions. In a way, the fate of their physical legacy parallels the fate of their fortune. What once seemed permanent and inexhaustible proved to be neither. The money was always flowing out faster than it was flowing in, a financial advisor to several Vanderbilt heirs explained. They lived as if the principal would never run out, but eventually it did. By the early 21st century, the Vanderbilt name no longer conjured images of unimaginable wealth. Gloria Vanderbilt, despite her successful fashion business, left a relatively modest estate when she died in 2019 at the age of 95. Her son, Anderson Cooper, has been open about the fact that he didn't inherit a significant fortune from his mother. "My mum made it clear there was no trust fund," Cooper told Howard Stern in an interview. "I'm glad. I think inheritance is a curse." Coming from a descendant of what was once America's wealthiest family, this statement speaks volumes about the Vanderbilt experience with inherited wealth. What the Commodore had seen as the ultimate achievement, amassing a fortune for his descendants, had in many ways become a burden rather than a blessing. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the Vanderbilt saga. Money, no matter how much, doesn't guarantee happiness or fulfillment. It doesn't even guarantee continued wealth unless carefully managed and preserved. What looks unshakable in one generation can be gone by the next. The Vanderbilts experienced the American dream in hyperspeed, a meteoric rise from poverty to unimaginable riches, followed by a gradual return to more modest circumstances. In that sense, they're not so different from countless other American families who have risen and fallen, just with more zeros attached to the numbers. People always ask me if I regret not having the Vanderbilt millions, a fifth-generation descendant reflected in a recent interview. But money doesn't define who you are. What you do with your life does. Some of my ancestors were miserable despite their wealth. Others found happiness in spite of it. In the end, the money was just a detail in a much more complicated story. After her son Carter's tragic death in 1988, Gloria Vanderbilt somehow found the strength to reinvent herself yet again. Already in her mid-60s by this point, an age when most people are thinking about retirement, Gloria channeled her grief into creativity. returning to her first love, art. "I've always painted," she tells a visitor to her studio in her Manhattan apartment, surrounded by canvases in various stages of completion. "Even as a little girl, it was my escape from loneliness." Her paintings and collages, often dreamlike and deeply personal, began to attract serious attention from galleries and collectors. She wrote memoirs and novels that drew on her extraordinary life experiences. In her 70s and 80s, when many of her contemporaries were slowing down, Gloria was experiencing a creative renaissance. "Age is irrelevant," she says in an interview on her 90th birthday. "I still feel like I'm 30, except that I have more wisdom and experience now." Meanwhile, her surviving son Anderson was building his own career as a journalist. After graduating from Yale, he took a job at Channel One News, reporting from war zones and disaster areas around the world. He deliberately chose not to use the Vanderbilt name professionally, wanting to succeed on his own merits, rather than trading on his famous heritage. "Did you ever worry about him?" a friend asked Gloria over lunch in the early 1990s, referring to Anderson's dangerous assignments in places like Somalia and Bosnia. Gloria's expression is complicated, pride mixed with fear, constantly. "But I understood his need to test himself, to find meaning in helping others. After losing Carter, well, I think Anderson needed to confront the fragility of life directly." What's fascinating about Anderson Cooper's career trajectory is that he was essentially rejecting the path that his Vanderbilt ancestors had created. Instead of living off inherited wealth and social position, he chose a profession that required him to work hard, take risks, and build his own reputation. "I knew at a young age I didn't want to be dependent on my mother's money or the Vanderbilt fortune, what little was left of it," Cooper explained in interviews years later. "I wanted to forge my own path." This attitude represented a significant shift from earlier Vanderbilt generations, who had largely viewed their wealth as an entitlement that enabled them to avoid conventional work. The Commodore would likely have been puzzled by a descendant who deliberately chose career over comfort, but he might also have recognized something of his own drive for independence in Anderson's choices. Gloria's relationship with her son was close, but respectful of boundaries. She never pressured him to leverage the Vanderbilt name, nor did she express disappointment when he chose journalism over more lucrative careers. "My mother taught me that you have to follow your passion," Anderson shared in a documentary years later. Given her own life experiences, she understood better than most that money doesn't guarantee happiness. Gloria's later years were comfortable, but not extravagant by Vanderbilt standards. She lived primarily in a Manhattan apartment filled with art and mementos from her remarkable life. She maintained a small staff, nothing like the dozens of servants her ancestors had employed, and focused on her creative work rather than social obligations. "The difference between my life and my great-great-grandfather's is night and day," she observes, to a journalist touring her home. "The Commodore had a mansion with 50 rooms. I have an apartment with 10, and honestly I prefer it this way, less to clean." In her final decades, Gloria became an unlikely social media star, collaborating with Anderson on a book and documentary about their relationship. Instagram users fell in love with this elegant nonagenarian who combined old-world glamour with thoroughly modern candor about life's challenges. "Did you ever imagine you'd be famous on something called Instagram at age 93? A young interviewer asks her. Gloria laughs. "Darling, I never imagined Instagram. When I was young, television was the new technology everyone was talking about, but I've always believed in embracing the new." This adaptability, This willingness to reinvent herself as times changed was perhaps Gloria's most remarkable quality. From the poor little rich girl of the 1930s to fashion designer in the 1970s, to artist and author in her later years, she refused to be defined by either her family name or her past experiences. The name Vanderbilt has opened some doors for me, she acknowledges in a late-life interview, and closed others, but ultimately I had to figure out who Gloria was, apart from any last name. When Gloria died in 2019 at the age of 95, she left behind a modest estate by Vanderbilt standards, estimated at around $200 million, much of which went to Anderson. The bulk of her inherited fortune had been lost decades earlier through a combination of mismanagement, poor advice, and excessive spending. What she left was largely the fruit of her own successful fashion and licensing businesses. My mum made clear to me there was no trust fund, Anderson told Howard Stern. There's no inheritance. I'm very thankful that my parents and my mum taught me that, and I think it's an initiative to create something on my own. This statement would have been unthinkable for earlier generations of Vanderbilts, for whom inheritance was the central fact of their financial lives. It marks a profound shift in values, from wealth preservation to self-creation, from passive inheritance to active earning. In this way, Anderson Cooper perhaps has more in common with his great-great-great-grandfather, the Commodore, than with the generations in between. Both had to make their own way in the world, relying on talent and determination rather than family money. But the Vanderbilt story isn't just about money. It's also about the peculiar burdens of famous names and outsized legacies. Throughout his career, Anderson has had to navigate the shadow of the Vanderbilt history, even while establishing his own distinct identity. People are always surprised when they learn my mother was Gloria Vanderbilt, he notes in an interview. I've never tried to hide it, but I don't lead with it either. It's just one fact about me, not the defining one. This approach, acknowledging the family connection without being limited by it, represents a healthy resolution to the complex psychological legacy of the Vanderbilt name. Unlike some of his ancestors, who seem trapped by their inherited identity, Anderson has found a way to honor his heritage while transcending it. The evolution of the Vanderbilt family across 6 generations offers a fascinating window into American attitudes toward wealth, class, and success. The Commodore, born in 1794, embodied the rough-edged capitalism of the early Republic, unregulated, unapologetic, and often brutal in its methods. His son, William Henry, represented the transition to more respectable business practices, though still focused primarily on accumulation. The third generation, the builders of the great mansions, reflected the Gilded Age obsession with European aristocracy and old-world refinement. They used their industrial wealth to mimic the trappings of noble birth, creating a uniquely American version of aristocracy based on dollars rather than titles. The fourth generation, coming of age around the time of World War I, began to shift from wealth accumulation to wealth preservation and social position. By the fifth generation, which included Gloria, the focus had moved to individual fulfillment and self-expression, often in artistic or creative fields rather than business. And now the sixth generation, represented by Anderson Cooper, has largely moved beyond Vanderbilt wealth entirely, building careers and identities separate from the family fortune and legacy. Each generation of our family has had to figure out its relationship to the Vanderbilt name, a distant cousin of Anderson's observed at a family gathering. For some, it was a golden ticket. For others, a burden. For most of us now, It's just an interesting footnote in our personal histories. Indeed, many contemporary Vanderbilts live thoroughly normal upper-middle-class lives. They're doctors, lawyers, teachers, business people, successful professionals, but not the mega-wealthy aristocrats their ancestors were. Most Americans wouldn't recognize them on the street or connect them to the legendary fortune. This normalization of the Vanderbilt descendants mirrors the broader democratization of American society over the past century. The extreme wealth gap of the Gilded Age, which allowed families like the Vanderbilts to live like European nobility, has somewhat narrowed. The ultra-wealthy still exist, of course, but the style of wealth has changed. My ancestor could build a 250-room house and staff it with 50 servants because that kind of inequality was accepted then, a current Vanderbilt descendant reflects. Today's billionaires might have multiple homes, but nothing approaching that scale. It would seem obscene now in a way it didn't then. The change in how wealth is displayed reflects evolving social values. While the Gilded Age celebrated conspicuous consumption, today's ultra-wealthy often emphasize philanthropy and social responsibility, at least publicly. The Vanderbilt mansions were built to impress. Modern billionaires more often tout their charitable foundations. The Commodore would be puzzled by Bill Gates giving away his fortune, suggests a historian of the Gilded Age. Not because the Commodore was uncharitable, he did establish Vanderbilt University after all, but because the scale and philosophy of modern philanthropy would seem alien to him. What remains of the Vanderbilt legacy today? Physically, not as much as you might expect given the scale of their former wealth. Most of the great mansions are gone. The railroad empire has been absorbed into larger corporate entities. The art collections have been dispersed through sales and donations, but certain landmarks endure. Vanderbilt University in Nashville continues to educate students, though its connection to the family is now largely nominal. The Breakers in Newport stands as a museum, offering visitors a glimpse into the opulent lifestyle of the Gilded Age. Biltmore Estate welcomes tourists to experience the grandeur of America's largest private home, still owned by George Vanderbilt's descendants. In New York City, Grand Central Terminal, rebuilt by the Vanderbilt-controlled New York Central Railroad in the early 20th century, remains one of the world's great public spaces, though few of the commuters rushing through it daily think about its connection to the family. There are also less tangible legacies. The Vanderbilt saga has become part of American mythology, a cautionary tale about the impermanence of fortune, a rags to riches to rags narrative that resonates with national beliefs about wealth and opportunity. Americans have always been fascinated by the rise and fall of great fortunes, notes a sociologist specializing in wealth studies. The Vanderbilt story satisfies both our admiration for self-made success and our suspicion of inherited privilege. In popular culture, the name Vanderbilt has become shorthand for old money and faded grandeur. It appears in countless novels, films, and television shows as a signifier of American aristocracy. The family that was once famous for its wealth is now famous for having been wealthy, a subtle but significant shift. For the surviving Vanderbilts, this cultural legacy is both a birthright and a challenge. How do you forge your own identity when your family name carries such historical weight? I remember the exact moment I realized my last name meant something to other people, recalls one young Vanderbilt descendant. I was about 7, introducing myself to a friend's parent, and they did a double take. Vanderbilt, like the family. It was the first time I understood that my name wasn't just mine. It belonged to history in some way. This experience, of having a personal identity that overlaps with the historical one, is shared by descendants of many famous families. But the Vanderbilts occupy a particular place in American consciousness as symbols of a specific moment in the nation's economic development. The Vanderbilt story resonates because it's ultimately about the American relationship with money, suggests a cultural historian. The family embodied both the promise of capitalism, that anyone could rise from poverty to immense wealth, and its limitations, that even the greatest fortunes can be lost if not properly managed. In this sense, the Vanderbilts serve as a kind of national parable about wealth and its meaning. The Commodore represents the acquisition phase, ruthless, ambitious, focused entirely on the accumulation of money and power. His immediate descendants exemplify the display phase, using wealth to establish social position and create lasting monuments to family prestige. Later generations embody the dilemma phase, struggling with the psychological and practical challenges of inherited wealth, trying to find personal meaning beyond the family fortune. And the current generation, largely detached from Vanderbilt money, represents the legacy phase, figuring out what the family story means when the fortune itself is gone. Every wealthy family goes through these stages eventually, observes a wealth advisor who works with multi-generational fortunes. What makes the Vanderbilts fascinating is that they went through the entire cycle so quickly and so publicly. Most family fortunes decline more slowly and with less drama. Indeed, the dramatic arc of the Vanderbilt saga, from the Commodore's humble Staten Island beginnings to the breathtaking opulence of the Gilded Age mansions, to Gloria's designer jeans empire to Anderson Cooper's CNN career, has few parallels in American history. It's a story that spans the full breadth of the American experience with wealth, from creation to dissolution. In a way, we're lucky the money didn't last, reflects one current Vanderbilt descendant. The cousins who grew up with the last of the real fortune had complicated relationships with it. Those of us born after it was mostly gone have had the freedom to become whoever we wanted to be. This perspective, that the loss of the fortune might have been a blessing in disguise, would likely have horrified the Commodore, who spent his life amassing wealth for his descendants. But it reflects a modern understanding of how inherited money can distort normal development and create dependency rather than opportunity. The irony is that many of today's Vanderbilts have achieved the American dream more authentically than their wealthy ancestors, notes a family historian. They've built careers, raised families, and found purpose without relying on inherited millions. In that sense, they might be closer to the Commodore's self-made spirit than the generations who simply lived off his fortune. As the sun sets on the Vanderbilt saga, what lessons can we draw from their extraordinary journey? Perhaps the most obvious is that no fortune, no matter how vast, is truly permanent. The wealth that seemed inexhaustible in the Commodore's day was largely gone within a century, dispersed through taxes, division among heirs, changing economic conditions and simple mismanagement. But there are deeper lessons too, about the nature of a legacy and what we pass on to future generations. The Commodore believed he was securing his family's future by leaving them money. In reality, the most valuable inheritance may have been the family story itself, a narrative rich with achievement and failure, excess and loss, that continues to offer meaning to Vanderbilt descendants and fascination to the broader public. Being a Vanderbilt today means being the custodian of a story, says a young family member. The money is gone, the mansions mostly demolished or turned into museums. What remains is this incredible American tale that happens to be our family history. That's a different kind of inheritance, but a meaningful one. As our journey through the Vanderbilt saga draws to a close, let's return to where it all began, Staten Island. That's where Jan Uertzen first stepped off the boat from the Netherlands in 1650, and where the Commodore was born a century and a half later. It's also where many Vanderbilts now rest for eternity, in a family cemetery and mausoleum that stands as one of the few remaining physical connections to their legacy. The Vanderbilt Family Cemetery and Mausoleum sits quietly on Staten Island, far from the glamour of Fifth Avenue or Newport. It's a beautiful but relatively modest structure designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who created so many of the family's grand homes. The mausoleum took inspiration from a Romanesque abbey in France. Even in death, the Vanderbilts looked to European models for their aesthetic. If you visit today, you'll find a peaceful place where generations of Vanderbilts are interred. The Commodore is there, alongside many of his descendants. The mausoleum remains a New York City landmark, one of the few tangible reminders of the family's once overwhelming presence in American life. There's something poetic about ending up back on Staten Island, a Vanderbilt descendant muses while visiting the family plot. The Commodore left here to conquer Manhattan and the business world. Now they've all returned. Indeed, there's a circular quality to the Vanderbilt story, a rise from humble beginnings on Staten Island, followed by a meteoric ascent to the heights of wealth and social power, and then a gradual return to more modest circumstances. The wheel of fortune, turning full circle over 6 generations. What would the Commodore think if he could see his descendants today? Would he be disappointed that the massive fortune he accumulated has largely dissipated? Or would he recognize in some of them, particularly those who have built their own careers rather than living off inheritance, something of his own self-made spirit? I think he'd be horrified by the mansions, suggests one family historian. The Commodore was ruthless and ambitious, but he wasn't ostentatious. He didn't build palaces or collect art. That came later, with his children and grandchildren. The Commodore's values were those of an earlier America: hard work, shrewd dealing, and relentless ambition. He had little interest in social position for its own sake. It was his descendants who tried to transform financial capital into social capital, using their inherited wealth to buy their way into the upper echelons of society. In this sense, the Vanderbilt saga reflects a broader American journey, from the rough-and-tumble capitalism of the early republic to the status-conscious consumerism of the Gilded Age to the more individualistic values of the modern era. America was changing throughout the Vanderbilt story, notes a cultural historian. The family both shaped and was shaped by those changes. They were never just passive inheritors of wealth. They were active participants in defining what wealth meant in American society. This is perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Vanderbilt legacy, not the money itself, which has largely disappeared, but the way they used that money to create a distinctly American version of aristocracy. Unlike European nobles, who derived status from bloodlines and royal favour, the Vanderbilts represented a new kind of elite based on financial achievement rather than birth. They were trying to figure out what it meant to be really rich in a country founded on democratic principles, explains a professor specializing in Gilded Age history. There was no roadmap for that. European aristocrats had centuries of tradition to guide them. The Vanderbilts were making it up as they went along. This improvised quality gives the Vanderbilt story its peculiarly American character. They were experimenting with wealth in a nation that simultaneously celebrated financial success and remained suspicious of inherited privilege. The tensions and contradictions in that position account for much of the family's complicated history. As night falls over the Vanderbilt mausoleum, the stone structure takes on a somber dignity. It's built to last centuries, unlike the fortune that paid for it. There's a lesson here about what truly endures, about the difference between money and legacy, between wealth and meaning. The current generation of Vanderbilts has had to grapple with these distinctions in their own lives. Without vast inherited wealth to define them, they've had to find purpose and identity through their own efforts. In many ways, this has freed them from the gilded cage that trapped some of their ancestors. The family money is gone, acknowledges one contemporary Vanderbilt, but the family itself continues. We're still here, still making our way in the world, still carrying forward a remarkable American story. This perspective, focusing on continuity of family rather than preservation of fortune, represents a healthier relationship with the Vanderbilt legacy than some earlier generations managed to achieve. The descendants who defined themselves entirely by their inheritance often struggled with purpose and identity. Those who have found meaning beyond the family money seem, on the whole, to lead more fulfilled lives. Money is a tool, not a purpose, Gloria Vanderbilt often said in her later years. It took me decades to understand that distinction. I hope future generations learn it more quickly than I did. This wisdom, hard-won through Gloria's experiences of both wealth and its loss, offers a valuable lens through which to view the entire Vanderbilt saga. The family story is not simply one of financial rise and fall, but of human beings trying to find meaning and purpose within the particular circumstances of their lives. Some found that meaning in collecting art, others in philanthropy, still others in creative pursuits or professional achievements. The least happy Vanderbilts were often those who defined themselves solely as heirs, passive recipients of the Commodore's bounty rather than active creators of their own lives. The burden of inherited wealth is that it can prevent you from discovering who you really are, observes a wealth counselor who has worked with many affluent families. Some of the Vanderbilts never had to develop their own identities, separate from the family money. That's a recipe for unhappiness, no matter how many mansions you own. This psychological aspect of the Vanderbilt story is perhaps its most relevant lesson for modern readers. In an era of growing wealth inequality and billionaires whose fortunes dwarf even the Commodores, the question of how money affects human development and fulfillment remains urgently relevant. You look at today's tech billionaires setting up elaborate trusts for their children, notes an estate planning attorney. They're wrestling with exactly the same questions the Commodore faced. How much is too much? What does it do to a person to inherit vast wealth they didn't earn? There are no easy answers. Indeed, many of today's ultra-wealthy cite the Vanderbilts as a cautionary tale, an example of how quickly a great fortune can disappear if not properly structured and managed. Warren Buffett, explaining his decision to give away most of his wealth rather than passing it to his children, specifically mentioned the Vanderbilt family as a model of what he wanted to avoid. The Vanderbilts had financial managers who tried to predict inflation, bond yields, stock returns, explains a financial historian, but they didn't account for the most unpredictable variable of all, human behavior. No financial model can tell you what happens when you give a 21-year-old more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. This human element, the psychological impact of extreme wealth on its possessors, runs like a current through the entire Vanderbilt story. From the Commodore's ruthless accumulation to his children's status, seeking to later generations' struggles with purpose, the family's relationship with money was always complex and often fraught. We think having unlimited money would solve all our problems, reflects a therapist who works with wealthy clients. The Vanderbilt story shows us that it often creates a whole new set of challenges. Extreme wealth doesn't exempt you from the basic human need to find meaning and purpose. If anything, it can make that search more complicated. As the moon rises over the Vanderbilt mausoleum, casting long shadows across the gravestones, there's a quiet reminder that wealth, in the end, is temporary. Even the greatest fortune in American history couldn't prevent the Commodore and his descendants from sharing the same fate that awaits us all. Death is the great equalizer, a cemetery caretaker once told me during a visit to the Vanderbilt plot. Rich or poor, famous or unknown, we all end up in the same sized box. What matters, then, is not the money itself, but what we do with the time we have, how we use whatever resources are available to us to create lives of meaning and purpose. Some Vanderbilts managed this despite their wealth, others failed because of it. The sun has set now on the Vanderbilt empire. The mansions are museums or demolished, the fortune divided and diminished, the railroad companies merged or bankrupted. What remains is the story, a uniquely American tale of ambition and excess, achievement and decline, of a family that embodied both the promise and the pitfalls of the American dream. I feel a connection to my ancestors, says a young Vanderbilt descendant visiting the family mausoleum for the first time, not because of their money, which is long gone, but because their experiences, their struggles and triumphs, their mistakes and achievements shaped the world I was born into. This sense of connection, of being part of a continuing human story that extends backward into the past and forward into the future, is perhaps the most valuable inheritance any family can pass down. The Vanderbilts, for all their wealth and all their losses, remain alive in the DNA of their descendants and in the collective memory of American culture. As we drift towards sleep, let's reflect on what the Vanderbilt saga can teach us about our own lives. Few of us will ever possess even a fraction of their wealth, but all of us face similar fundamental questions. What gives our lives meaning? How do we define success? What legacy do we hope to leave for those who come after us? The Vanderbilts, for all their privilege, struggled with these same questions. Money gave them extraordinary opportunities, but didn't exempt them from the basic human search for purpose and connection. Their story reminds us that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what possesses us, the passions, relationships, and values that give our lives meaning. In Staten Island, the Vanderbilt Mausoleum stands silent under the stars, a monument not just to a family but to the transience of material success. The fortune that built it has vanished, but the story endures, a reminder that what we build within ourselves and our relationships may ultimately prove more durable than what we build with stone and money. The richest Vanderbilt and the poorest of their descendants share the same earth now, equal in the democracy of death. But while they lived, each had the same fundamental human opportunity to discover purpose, to create meaning, to find love, to leave some small positive mark on the world they briefly inhabited. As you lie in your comfortable bed, far more comfortable than anything the Commodore knew as a boy on Staten Island, though perhaps less opulent than the silk-sheeted beds of Biltmore, remember that your life, like every life, is a story in progress. The Vanderbilts had extraordinary resources but faced the same essential human challenge we all do: to use whatever we have, much or little, in ways that create meaning and connection. Their saga, spanning centuries and billions, ultimately distills to the same questions that each of us faces in the quiet moments before sleep. Did I use today well? Did I move closer to becoming the person I want to be? Am I creating a life that reflects my deepest values? Money, the Vanderbilts discovered across generations, could build palaces but couldn't answer these questions. That work falls to each of us, regardless of the balance in our bank accounts. As your consciousness begins to drift toward dreams, perhaps there's comfort in knowing that even America's once richest family face the same fundamental human challenges we all do, and that true wealth has never been measured in dollars alone. The stars shine over the Vanderbilt Mausoleum tonight. The same stars that guided the Commodore's ferries across the harbor nearly 2 centuries ago. The fortune is gone, the palaces mostly vanished, but the human story continues, in the lives of the Vanderbilt descendants, in the cultural memory of America, and now in your thoughts as you drift gently into sleep.